Professor Norm Finkelstein, thank you for joining me today. Can you introduce yourself to an audience that might not altogether be familiar with you? Not only are you a professor, but you're an activist, an author, political scientist. But how do you describe yourself?
Well, there's a personal autobiography, and then there's a professional one. In my case, it's hard to separate out the two. I don't like to play the Holocaust card, but it had such a fundamental impact on me that it's impossible to describe myself without beginning there. Both of my parents were survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. They were in the Warsaw. They grew up in Warsaw, were in the Warsaw Ghetto from 1940 to 1943. When the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was repressed, there were about 30,000 survivors, among whom were my two parents, who were then deported to Majdanek concentration camp. My mother then ended up in two slave labor camps. My father was in Auschwitz and on the Auschwitz death march. On both sides of my family, every member was exterminated. So I had no grandparents, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, nothing. Everybody was wiped out. And that's the objective fact. And then the subjective fact is, for reasons which I frankly can't explain, my parents had very idiosyncratic politics. I wouldn't call them communist, I would call them very pro-Soviet. And that distinction may not mean anything to your listeners, and frankly, didn't even mean very much to my generation. But my parents would not brook any criticism of the Soviet Union because so far as they were concerned, and factually it's true, it was the Soviet Union that defeated the Nazis, and they looked at the world through the lens of the Nazi Holocaust. The Soviet Red Army defeated the Nazis, case closed, nothing more further be said. You weren't in my home allowed to utter a single word of criticism of Stalin. Long after the Communist parties had denounced him, still in my home, it was a taboo to utter a single word of criticism of Stalin. And so it was a strange home. I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood, lower middle class Jewish. My high school, you'll know many of the graduates of my high school, literally, not just figuratively. Bernie Sanders went to my high school. Charles Schumer went to my high school. Ruth Bader Ginsburg went to my high school. Stanley Kaplan of the Kaplan SAT and GRE prep courses went to my high school. It was a lower middle class, like Bernie was, and like Charles Schumer's parents. His father was an exterminator. Like both of them were lower middle class, as you know, having been close to Bernie. He has very vivid memories, which he seemed to have carried throughout his life, of the fights at home over money. And it was a very painful thing, it's clear, for him to have witnessed personally. And we went through that in my home. And that was the milieu. The milieu obviously had very different outcomes. And the outcomes are Charles Schumer and Bernie Sanders grew up within blocks of each other. And they obviously they came from the same exact background, exactly the same lower middle class background. They took two altogether different trajectories in life. I grew up in that milieu, hyper ambitious to the point that it really corrupted the soul of people in my grade school and in my high school. The ambition.
What kind of ambition? Because there's lots of different types of ambition, right?
The ambition was to make it, to succeed. After World War II, for reasons which haven't been fully explained, all the barriers to Jewish success fell away. And this was the generation which was going to make it in American society. And, Bernie Sanders and Charles Schumer and all the other people I mentioned were exemplary. So making it meant, first of all, becoming a doctor. That's no joke. That was literally the case. First of all, it was becoming a doctor. Even Chuck Schumer started out on the doctor track
Mm.
at Harvard until he said one day I discovered I was alone in the laboratory for one of my classes, and he says I noticed nobody was paying me attention, and he liked the crowd, he liked being center of attention. You may recall, you're so young, none of the things I will say to you have much resonance. But in the 1970s, our mayor in New York was Mayor Koch.
Mm.
And Koch was the old Jewish school, the one who went to City College, which was the public university here. And graduating from City was an accomplishment. It was the Depression era. And Schumer was the younger generation. They went to Harvard. And Schumer and Koch didn't get along at all because it was a culture clash and a generational clash. And Koch was not a nice guy at all. Not a nice guy at all. He coined the expression to schum. He made it a verb, SCHUME. And to schum was to crane your head out in any picture. And that was Joe Schumer. So he started out a doctor, but he decided he wanted to schum. He liked the attention. And so he went into law. He went to Harvard Law. And then he went into politics. His mother was very unhappy. She wanted him to go into corporate law. She didn't see any future. And I remember when he was running as an assemblyman, because I knew his sister. His sister was 1 year ahead of me. She's extremely impressive. Extremely impressive.
Well, Professor Finkelstein, I got to ask you, with all these impressive people coming out of this high school, I mean, what do you think it was about this one high school or this one community that generated so many big names?
It's a good question. First of all, it was not typical. Every high school had its famous graduate, Midwood, which is Midwood High School. Its famous graduate was Woody Allen. Erasmus High School, its famous graduate was Barbara Streisand. But we had a lot more than one or two. I would say the combination was the attachment that Jews put to achievement and scholarship, combined with that hyper insatiable ambition. It was Cassius, the lean and hungry look. They were not, I want to be candid about it, they were not nice people to be around. However, it was for me I don't want to call it a wonderful experience, but it forced me to maximize my potential in order to stay on par. I wasn't on par with these, Chuck Schumer was an extremely bright guy. He was valedictorian of his class, but also there was no near second to him. He was in a class all his own. There was no question about that. As was Fran. I remember once talking about his sister Fran, who I knew. And I was once talking to some people in the car about Fran, and they said, they liked Fran because Fran didn't compete against the other people. She competed against herself. She was so above everybody else that she was just competing against. So it made for a nice friend because there wasn't that lean and hungry, look. So I think it was the combination of the hyper ambition, which was not nice, combined with the fact that academic achievement, the highest premium was paid on it. My generation, we didn't excel in sports because sports was seen during the anti-war movement. It was seen as a kind of jock thing. And jocks were pro-war, conservative. I can even tell you, the coach of our high school football team was Mr. Caruso. And the leading anti-war person was the chair of the physics department, Mr. Cap.
Mm-hmm.
And Cap and Caruso, they would go at it
Mm.
in public in the auditorium. So we associated sports with the jocks.
Well, wasn't Bernie Sanders a champion track
Yes, he
star,
was.
running
He was
4-minute miles?
he was a champion track star. Uh, I know you've read his. I'm sure you've read his little autobiography. It's an interesting comment on him because he only devoted 14 pages to the first 20 years of his life.
Hmm.
And I did notice reading it that he made mention that he ran the mile in 4 minutes 20 seconds or something.
Mm-hmm.
Bernie was an unusual guy because he was cerebral, but he was not academically competitive.
Mm.
When he went to the University of Chicago, he said he spent many hours in the library and many hours reading, but he didn't do particularly well in his classes.
Mm-hmm.
So he was not of that hyper competitive. There was a type in high school like him. He was the introvert. You knew he was smart, but he wasn't the elbower. He wasn't, pumping the elbows to get, the roller derby, to get out of the pack. Wasn't his thing. I don't want to, put him on a pedestal. Like all of us, he has his flaws, but there are many redeeming qualities about him, and that I think is one of them. He was not the hyper ambitious type, though he was very thoughtful. He was very thoughtful. You saw his quality come out. I thought, I don't want to get too off the beaten track, but when John Lewis from Georgia, the alleged conscience of the Senate, which is about as much as saying the conscience of the best little whorehouse in Texas, but
Professor.
A conscience of the House, Congress. But Lewis, you recall when he said that he remembers Hillary and Bill from the civil rights movement, but he had no recollection of Bernie Sanders.
Right, of course. I think it was specific even about the March on Washington. He said, I don't recall seeing Bernie Sanders there, which is a pretty remarkable thing to say about such a well-populated, highly attended event. As though he was counting heads.
Yeah, Hillary was, Girls for Goldwater at the time.
Right.
But what was interesting about Bernie is, if you recall, he didn't respond.
Mm.
He waited for that picture by serendipity. Picture surfaced of him being arrested.
Mm-hmm.
But normally the instinct is, what the hell are you talking about? I was organizing for CORE at University of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't do any of that.
Well, do you think that because I felt like the picture was really serendipitous. I don't think it was the product of
Absolutely.
like a research team or
Somebody
anything.
happened to find it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it feels less like Bernie, sat on it because he knew he would be vindicated. But
no, absolutely. That's what I'm saying. He wasn't the type. He wasn't so aggressive and so belligerent in his persona. He's, for better or for worse, I followed, your generation's debates about whether Bernie wasn't aggressive enough in the debates and all that. Whether you felt he was or wasn't, that's his personality.
Yeah.
Well,
I wanna, complete the circle on your story. So you come out of this hyper ambitious, hyper competitive environment, and you end up at Princeton. Is that correct?
In graduate school, yes.
Okay. So you obviously didn't become a doctor. So what was your path? How did you channel your ambitions?
I knew from a young age, look, everybody passes through that period when they're idealistic and where they're out to conquer the world in a good way. Even I'm reading now Bill Clinton's memoir, very, very excellent read. It's a little bit how shall I say it? It's kind of overwhelming. It's 1,000 pages, single spaced, a tiny font, tiny font. Because Clinton has a prodigious memory,
Mm,
and he acknowledges every single person who walked in and out of his life.
mm,
It's it's a genuine sight to behold. He only kept the journal in Oxford for I think a year or 2 years. It's not entirely clear, but otherwise it's all being plucked from his memory. In any case, Clinton, he was never an anti-war type. He was not. He makes that clear in the book. Nonetheless, it's also true to say he he was an assistant to J. William Fulbright, who was the great anti-war hero of the Senate at the time. Fulbright was from Arkansas. When Clinton was a junior in college at Georgetown, he went to work for Fulbright. And then he was the organizer in his area for McGovern. And George McGovern, 1972, was definitely a left candidate. About that, there's no question. And he was actually a quite decent person. He was a quite decent person, no question. So Clinton went through those idealistic years, and so did Hillary. Now remember, Hillary started out working for Mary Wright Edelman,
mm-hmm,
Children's Defense Fund,
mm-hmm,
invested a lot of time. My point being, everybody went through, for my generation, all right, let's not say everyone, but a large number of people went through that quote unquote idealistic phase. I knew inside me, I would not change because I was a radical, clear as day. High school, I supported the Black Panthers.
mm.
Uh,
And where did this was in New York?
Madison High School.
Hmm.
1970 Christmas, even though I'm Jewish, I sent out Angela Davis Christmas cards. Of course, my friends thought I was completely nuts. Good Jewish boys didn't do that.
Well, I think good Jewish boys probably weren't sending out any Christmas cards whatsoever, much the less
No.
abolitionist with a raised fist on them.
No, that times have changed. Religion played no part whatever in anyone's life I knew growing up.
Mm.
No part whatsoever. This whole discovering their Jewishness, it was, in my opinion, it was a pure invention. Was this a sign of the times, where after the kind of peace and love and genuine sense of community of the 1960s, the counterculture, when it began to disintegrate, then people retreated into I'll use the expression, you can disagree, began to retreat into their tribal identities. And that's when Jews began to discover their Jewish tribal identity. But I knew Charles Schumer, I knew Franz Schumer, I knew that generation. Nobody talked religion, nobody talked Israel. Israel was not part of the conversation. Because you have to remember, back then, Israel was poor. It was very poor. It was an austere, kibbutz-like life, which you might enjoy for a summer. But we were American Jews, and we were out to make it here, not in some backwater in the Middle East. So Israel was not on our radar. It was never talked about.
So, Professor, you mentioned that you knew that you were a radical
Yes.
and that you were not going to
I knew I
change.
was radical. I knew that.
But how did you know that you weren't going to change?
I knew it because I was deeply affected by the suffering of my parents. My mother, in particular, was never able to let go of what happened.
Mm.
She belonged to the Polish Jewish middle class.
Mm.
She has, by her memory, and I think it was not exaggerated, she had a wonderful youth. She went to the best schools, private schools. She knew her Latin. She was very good in math, went to study mathematics at Warsaw University,
Mm.
which you can imagine for a Jewish woman was not so common.
Mm.
She was president of her grade
Mm.
and president of her school at the same time. And then, in the blink of an eye, so to speak, and it wasn't much longer than the blink of an eye, her world was turned upside down and it was shattered.
Mm.
And her mind was too deep to let go of it. Now, you may have trouble understanding that. In one of his books, Primo Levi, he wrote that there were two kinds of survivors of the camps. One kind, they experienced the Nazi Holocaust as blows to the head. They were shattered, but they couldn't make sense of what happened. It was just these hammer blows to the skull. And the other type, he said, they realized that something profound happened to them. That's something that spoke to something deep in the human condition. And like Primo Levi, my late mother, she was always trying to make sense of what happened. What happened there? So she could never let go of it because I think her mind was too capacious.
So what was it then about the process, the cognitive process of her trying to reconcile what had happened
I
that
think
led you to behave differently than so many others of your
because
generation
I
and
could not
stick? Yeah.
I could not be indignant at the silence. I know this will sound like a cliche, and in fact, it is in part a cliche. I couldn't be silent I couldn't be indignant in the face of the silence of the world to my parents' suffering if I myself turned out the same way.
Mm.
So it was kind of a way to justify my own indignation
Mm.
of what befell my parents to stay true to my youthful convictions.
So it was a way to resist a kind of hypocrisy. If you did
Yeah,
not act, it was a kind of a betrayal
yes.
almost
And
of what your
I'll
parents
tell
were
you the truth.
going through.
I had very big battles with my parents over these things. I'm old enough, I'm adult enough as my the finitude of my life approaches to be candid about these things because I do attach a lot of value to truth. I had quarrels with my parents who were very good in words, but not always so good in deeds, even when it came to racial questions, because it was that lower middle class community. And if you've ever grown up in a community like that, there's nothing more sacred than property values.
Mm.
And property values, as you know, because you're educated and you're attuned to the ways of the world, property values typically went through the floor if a Black person moved in your neighborhood.
Mm.
And my parents were not indifferent to property values, and they weren't indifferent to money.
Yeah.
So there were quarrels over that. Some of them, I would say, they could get out of hand.
Hmm.
And
So I,
also on the
mhm.
question of the Israelis, when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, which was a turning point for quite a number of people in my generation, you wouldn't know it lasted from June till September, and Israel killed between 15 and 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, much worse than anything that happens in the typical Israeli massacres in Gaza. There, the numbers are usually about 1,500, 2,000. This was 15 to 20,000. And I had convinced my mother to speak at a rally in support of the Palestinians.
Hmm.
She didn't come. I was deeply disappointed.
Hmm.
We got into a very angry exchange over it. And she said, if I spoke at that rally, they'll blow up my house. That's what she said. They'll blow up my house, meaning like the
Who's
Jewish Defense League or
hmm.
the paramilitary Jewish organizations of the time, like what was called the JDL. They would blow up my house. And I would say, so what do you expect other people to do for you when you were in those circumstances? You know, we argued, we quarreled.
Well, what was her response to that kind of a direct question? Did she not
Her
see?
response was always the same. You may not like the response. I'm going to just tell it to you. I suffered enough.
Hmm.
That was her
Hmm.
view. She was always afraid when I went to demonstrations, I would get killed. After Kent State, those things became realistic possibilities, not likelihoods, but possibilities. And she would always say to me, Norman, we're only 5 people in the world, meaning my mother, my father, my 2 siblings, and me. I lost enough. So that was her attitude. Uh, Frankly, very hard to argue with.
Yeah, and I don't want to come back to that because it's a theme that has came up in a recent episode that we did, and it's a recurring theme about that comes up when you talk to people from historically marginalized groups about what they should do, shouldn't do, should advise other people to do when it comes to coalition building and dealing with the rising kind of
I saw
kinds
that.
of
I saw
extremism
that
and things like
episode.
that. And
It,
I don't want to get derailed by that right now because I really do just want to
it
close the
was
loop really quickly on
actually it was repeated yesterday on This Is Revolution, that program,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very funny.
Well, I haven't caught that, but I do want. I just we still haven't actually gotten to
Yeah.
Professor Finkelstein, who you actually are and what you're most famous for. So obviously, I mean, you ended up going to grad school and you studied what in grad school?
Um, I don't even know. I studied politics, but I wasn't a terrific student.
Okay, and you did ultimately become a professor.
Well, I would say that was my formal calling,
Mm-hmm.
but becoming a professor generally means at some point getting a settled position and acquiring tenure.
Right. And so that's what I want to get
And
to.
I
The
never really,
disagreements and the conflict and the controversy that one might argue led to you not actually securing tenure. So one of the things I think you're most known for is your advocacy for Palestinian rights and outspokenness over Israel-Palestine conflict, but also your kind of open disputing, your open debating with Alan Dershowitz. Can you give us a little bit of background into how that emerged?
well, I want to set the context. I don't feel I was just a sort of a verbal pugilist.
Mm.
I work very hard. I take the study seriously. I won't call it the study of the mind. I recently watched a documentary on Wittgenstein and that study of the mind. I'll just say I take my I take being an academic or a scholar. I take it seriously. I work very hard. My first claim to fame came when so-called claim to fame, big fish, small sea, when I exposed an academic hoax, and it was a book called From Time Immemorial by this alleged author, uh, Joan Peters. And the book was a huge event when it came out. It was endorsed by the likes of the historian Barbara Tuchman, Elie Wiesel, Saul Bellow, you name it. It was a who's who in arts and letters endorsed the book. And for reasons which obviously we can't go into now, I applied my mental energy to trying to make sense of the book. And I concluded, I think convincingly, that the book was a fraud, a hoax. And it made me a lot of enemies who now had egg on their face for having embraced this book, which almost certainly none of them read, because even back then, nobody read books. So I then became kind of known as the person off the spectrum who knew what he was talking about. The person off the spectrum who was a force to contend with. Those who knew enough to know, don't debate me. I'm serious. I knew what I was talking about. I studied very hard. I worked very hard. And so at some point, I ended up in the same studio as Alan Dershowitz. And much to his surprise, I had read his book. He was promoting a book called The Case for Israel. He later charged that the host of the show, Amy Goodman, and he went around saying that we ambushed him. And I replied, well, there is some truth to that, because it really wasn't fair that between Alan Dershowitz and myself, only one of us had read his book. It was very funny. If you ever had a chance, have a moment just for your amusement, I kept goading him in the program. I wouldn't quite call it a debate because, as I said, he didn't know what was in the book. But I kept goading him in the program. I kept saying, the book you claim to have written, the book you
Okay, so what do you mean about that? I mean, what was the book about, and what was
the book you allegedly wrote? So at one point, he got very, he realized he can't avoid this question. So he says, what do you mean? What do you mean claim to have written? So I realized now I better be careful, because we could have a serious lawsuit on our hands. So I replied, Professor Dershowitz, for your sake and your reputation, I hope you didn't write that book.
Well, you give us some background about what it was in this book that was.
It was just pure Israeli propaganda. It was complete nonsense, and believe me, I don't say those things cavalierly. People think that I just talk off the top of my head, that I'm throwing firebombs here and there. It's not true. It's not true at all. I sat down and read that book very carefully. I went through it footnote by footnote by footnote. It was a complete and total fraud and fake. And if there's any doubt about it, if there's any dispute about that, after the debate, I proceeded to write a whole book on the subject. It's called Beyond Chutzpah. And it's basically a dissection of Dershowitz's The Case for Israel. It was published by University of California Press, a very respectable publishing house. And nobody has found any errors in it. So, yes, the allegation was audacious, but what Alan Dershowitz did was also audacious. You went to Harvard. You remember there was a time when there were three professors at one time who were accused of plagiarism. Charles Ogletree,
Mm.
he had written a book in the civil rights movement, you remember? And there were passages which it was very funny, his defense. Do you remember what his defense was?
No, what was it?
His defense was that my researchers wrote those passages and I
Oh,
didn't
that is
read
familiar,
them.
actually. Yeah, that is familiar. So okay,
And then
yeah.
Tribe was accused of Lawrence Tribe was accused of plagiarism. And Dershowitz, that's not unusual in academia. You get other
Mm,
people to write your books. They
mm,
do
mm.
have the 10 pages of research assistants. I just exposed it in the case of Dershowitz because it happened to have political ramifications.
Right. Alan Dershowitz being extremely high profile, not just because he is a professor at Harvard, but because he has been a part of a lot of these high profile kind of defense teams, from the O.J. Simpson defense team.
Mostly, mostly
Mhm,
it's spousal battery, spousal
mhm,
abuse, and murder. That's
mhm.
if you look at his profile.
Mike
For,
Tyson, Patty Hearst, Leona Hemsley, Julian. Oh, well,
no,
how is he involved with Julian Assange?
he he was
Jim.
Assange. I know Julian Assange, and he told me a bit apologetically that he had went to Dershowitz because Dershowitz was well connected, and
Mm,
he thought the only way to get himself out was to have some connection with people in power.
right.
Um,
So I want to get to the meat of the discussion if we can. So I just to wrap up this introductory bit, the point of the matter is that this public debate with Alan Dershowitz certainly didn't do you any favors with respect to your academic career, but that does not thwart you, obviously, and the advocacy that you want to do. And so we started talking because you're currently engaging in a project of writing a book where you are very critical of Barack Obama. And you do a deep dive into kind of the hagiography of Barack Obama and many of the um, biographies that have been done both by Obama himself and these other writers, and start to pick apart part of this narrative that exists about how he is exceptional in all of these ways, academically, intellectually, rhetorically, etc., as kind of inaccurate. And so I want to first ask you why it is that you think it is important at this moment to be critical of Barack Obama.
Let me just give you the context. I'm writing a book on cancel culture and academic freedom. And the part in cancel culture deals a lot with the current wokeness phenomenon and political correctness and identity politics that cluster. And I had scattered remarks in the manuscript about Obama, the Obama phenomenon,
Hmm.
because I frankly did not want to have to wade through a huge body of literature on Barack Obama. It just didn't feel like that was the way I wanted to spend my summer, because I consider him and his acolytes to be utterly trivial. And I just, you have a choice between reading Kant and reading this drivel. I wasn't about to read Kant at my age and the kind of mental focus it requires, but this seemed many cuts below. Um, but then it occurred to me I just really had to address the Barack Obama phenomenon because it was the most distilled form of identity politics.
So
He
what?
became
Mhm.
his whole ascent to power, beginning with the 2004 Democratic National Convention, was built entirely not on his politics, But on his person, there was no politics. Barack Obama, the whole cult of Obama, it's totally devoid of politics.
So,
It's
so what you're
closer to Elmer Gantry. He was a faith healer. He is a faith healer.
so just before we get into the specifics, I just wanted to be clear. The reason you want to focus on Barack Obama is not because of Obama per se, but because he is an example of a broader phenomenon that's going on with the way identity politics is politicized. And you think that he is a good example
He's not
to
a
use
good
to unpack
example.
that?
He is the perfected example.
Okay.
He is the perfected example. He rose to power on one fact and one fact alone, that he was a Black man running for president. There was no attention paid to what he stood for because he didn't stand for anything.
So I want to get into that, but I just want to first really lay the foundation because a lot of people will say, the same way that other critics of Obama have had this said about them, like Cornel West, that the reason there is this particularized focus on Obama and a certain kind of peak associated with some of the criticism is about jealousy. It's about, other things other than a substantive criticism. And because of the way identity politics works in this country, it is very easy to marginalize Obama criticism on the basis that it's rooted in racism or jealousy or hysteria or something other than substance.
Mhm.
And so I think it's important to situate this critique within a broader critique of identity politics. So I want you to go ahead now. What is your evidence for Barack Obama being solely a candidate that is benefited by basically a phenomenon that wouldn't exist but for his racial identity? Because that is, as you well know, a claim that is very controversial, not in the context of this podcast and these listeners, many of whom are familiar with my own work and criticism of identity politics, but to the audience beyond this who might hear.
Well, let's begin at the end rather than at the beginning. It's very striking when you read his volume 1 of his memoir, A Promised Land, that at one point I thought it was actually the most revealing comment in the entire 700 pages. He says that in the 2008 election, I'm using his words, he said, I pulled off a neat trick. That's how he put it, a neat trick. He said, I created a blank slate. That's his words. I create a blank slate on which everybody could project anything they wanted. What amazed me reading that is that he practically boasts about the fact that he stood for nothing. That's how we got.
Well, let me offer some pushback. Let me play devil's advocate a little bit, because there is an argument that any politician seeking to be successful on a national level in a pluralistic society like the one we have is going to have to resist a certain kind of specificity and have a broad appeal. And is the problem really that he presented himself as malleable enough for different kinds of people to attach themselves to? Or was the problem ultimately that he didn't have an agenda to follow up with that was more particularized and was more ideological, and that he was more committed to once he actually achieved the goal of getting into office?
Well, I would certainly say it's the latter. He had no agenda. I don't think Obama has a political bone in his body, to be perfectly honest about it. He was in the state Senate for about 7 years, the Illinois State Senate, which was a part-time job, and mostly they just schmooze. He describes him playing cards with the Republicans. And, it's not a serious political. It's like politics in Albany, New York, or I don't know what's the equivalent in Washington, but it's very sleazy, very squalid, very smarmy. This is state politics. And you have to multiply it several fold because we're talking about Illinois, Chicago, Illinois. Uh, and then he was in the Senate for 1 year before he decided, I'm running for president. There was no agenda. He ran on a platform called Hope and Change, and it excited people with the prospect of something radically new going to happen.
So
then immediately as he comes to power, he appoints his cabinet. Who is his cabinet? Larry Summers, Timothy Geithner, Hillary Clinton, Robert Gates, the defense secretary for George W. Bush. This is not change. It was perfectly obvious he's not going to change anything. And what was interesting is, if you read some of the memoirists, people like the editor of The New Yorker, his name just...
Remnick.
Yeah, David Remnick. He says in The New Yorker, well, it was clear as day that Obama was just your run-of-the-mill left, center Democrat. But that's not how Remnick projected him. That's not how he was presented. They presented him as being this wholly new phenomenon that was going to radically change the way we do things. And
so the
once
issue
he got elected,
mm-hmm.
suddenly Remnick says, well, it was plain as day that Obama was no different. And in fact, if you go through, from any other typical mainstream Democrat, if you go through, as I did, the memoirs of his campaign team, David Plouffe and David Axelrod, what were called the two Davids. You read it closely. Axelrod was the campaign strategist. That was his title. Plouffe was the campaign manager. And if you go through it carefully, there were only two things where he, meaning Barack Obama, differed from Hillary Clinton. They differed on whether or not you should talk unconditionally to enemy leaders. Barack said yes, Hillary said no. And they differed on this very minor issue about a federal tax on fuel, on gasoline. That was it. There was no difference between them.
So before we go down this road any farther, I just want to really stop and make sure that the points are clarified as we go along. So the issue isn't that Barack Obama was necessarily any different than any number of politicians who we've alluded to in the course of this conversation. You spoke somewhat favorably about Bill Clinton having been a decent person in his youth and in the midst of his idealistic phase. I think a lot of politicians could be similarly described as ambitious. You certainly described a lot of people from your high school as having a certain kind of ambition that doesn't necessarily damn them personally. But I think the real danger you're describing with Barack Obama is that although he was in a lot of ways a very typical politician, he was framed as more radical and more to the left in a way that potentially occupied space and deluded people into thinking that there was a movement afoot that didn't actually exist. And I think ultimately served the purpose of deflating, I think, some sincere movement energy for quite some time. And his identity was in service of that fact. Is that an accurate?
I would say I'm listening very carefully to everything you're saying, and I'm processing it. I would enter two caveats to what you said. Number one, he was very different than Clinton and, say, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, whether you like it or not, they were very serious politicians.
What do you mean by that?
Well, that's what I'm going to say. Bill Clinton, he had a terrifying grasp of public policy. He knew all the details. He studied it. He loved it. He loved the give and take, the rough and tumble, the gregariousness of being a politician. Every chapter of his memoir, and I loved it. he really knew the fine details of public policy and also foreign policy. Um, I can give illustrations of it later if you would like. Jimmy Carter, I read his memoir, Keeping the Faith. It was really pretty breathtaking. Now, I know the Israel-Palestine conflict quite well. I know it as well, I would say, as anybody in the world at this point, and probably better than anyone in the world. And I should hope it's the case because I focused on it for 40 years. Jimmy Carter, his best known achievement, if you call it an achievement, was negotiating the treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1977 through 79, the Camp David Accord. His mastery of the subject matter and also of diplomacy, politics, it was absolutely breathtaking.
And you feel differently about Barack Obama having read his
Obama had no
memoirs
interest
and
in
work.
politics.
It's hard when you say. I want to be clear because when you say something like he has no interest in politics, that feels kind of implausible when you're talking about someone who became the president of the United States of America. So do you mean?
If I were to say, excuse me, Brianna, I shouldn't interrupt you. So you'll just allow me just make this point, and I want to hear back from you. Okay. If I were to say to you, George Bush, W. Bush had no interest in politics, would that surprise you?
Well, I would ask you how you're defining politics, because to me, politics encompasses a lot of things, some of which George Bush obviously has a deep interest in, as does Obama. What I'm kind of pushing you toward is perhaps being more specific in what you mean by politics.
I don't think that. I think let's just backtrack. I don't think Ronald Reagan had a political bone in his body. He was a very good, as they called him, a great communicator.
Well, that's my point. I guess I would describe communication as being a pretty significant part of politics.
No, I would not. I would not say that being a dummy, as against the ventriloquist, is a particularly political thing. There were books written at the time on the Reagan phenomenon. A guy who probably put in, they said, about 3 hours a day, sitting at his desk eating jelly beans, and they created a myth. They created a Reagan myth. He brought down the Berlin Wall. He did this. He did that. He didn't do anything.
Right, but I'm not really disputing that.
George Bush, it was clear. I mean, I read the memoirs. It was people like Condoleezza Rice. They were desperate to try to find something there. So she would say at one point in this very lengthy memoir, she would say, he had a keen strategic eye. See, she just threw it in because it was Rumsfeld and Cheney who were doing everything. I mean, Rumsfeld and Cheney, they were fanatics in the sense they were real politicians. They worked very hard, nonstop. I remember, just by coincidence, since I mentioned my high school, one of my high school friends, a brilliant guy, recently passed away from a rare cancer. He was in charge of the computer system in the Bush White House. He's the chief technology officer for, you'll know it because you're in Washington, for Unisys. You know the computer company in Washington, Unisys? It's the defense contract. He was the chief technology officer, number one in the place. And he occasionally we would talk, not much because I didn't like the path he took in life. We would occasionally talk, and he'd say, Norm, they work very hard. They work very hard. And Mark, my friend Mark, he was a very hard worker himself. And it was true. Cheney and Rumsfeld, they had a real work ethic. You know, Rumsfeld, he stood at a podium when he was working. They used to call it his snowflakes. He was constantly sending out memos. He put in a solid 13, 14 hours a day working.
Sure, but I guess what I'm trying to point to, though, what my argument would be is that lots of people work very hard in lots of different capacities, and that doesn't make them politicians or good at politics, right?
Let me give you another example to illustrate my point. Okay?
Sure.
And I appreciate the pushback, and I'm willing to be corrected. when I'm wrong.
Well, it's not that you're wrong. I'm just asking. You obviously have something specific in
Okay,
mind when you say
I'll give you
someone's a
an
good
example.
politician. So what is it?
Okay, I'll give
Because
you.
when I say politics, I say someone's ability to communicate and endear themselves to a community of people that needs to vote for them, turn out voters, inspire
I
people,
would not
in
say.
addition to the
I would not call
concrete
that
politics of
politics.
it.
That could be a person with a very insecure ego could do that. That's not politics.
Well,
Let me
someone who doesn't have that,
let
for
me.
whatever reason, isn't able to ever get in office. And so
Okay,
you can be a politician privately in your bedroom talking to a wall, but it doesn't make you an actual
okay.
elected
Let
official
me.
because you can't get elected because nobody likes you.
Okay,
So
I'm
that's
afraid.
when people say things like Hillary Clinton is not an effective politician, what they're
No,
pointing to is
she's
her
political.
inability to connect with people despite having, I think, some of the features that you would think of as making her a very strong politician in terms of understanding the nuts
I
and bolts
think
and
I think
gears and
um we're I think a little bit confused, mixing apples and oranges. There's a difference between being a political person and being a good politician. I am a political person. I'm the lousiest politician, as anybody can concede. I didn't achieve anything in life in terms of my professional career.
Hmm.
Um, let's just take some examples quickly because there's so much else to discuss, but you're pressing me on this point, which is your prerogative, and I want to try to respond to it. When the Bush White House ended, Bush got on a motorcycle and went off into the night. He never talked about politics anymore, except when his memoir came out and he did a book tour for the memoir. Otherwise, as you know, he retired into making paintings, into painting. And I always understand the paintings aren't bad. At least people tell me. I'm not a judge. Cheney, from the day after the Bush White House, he was still every day. It's on Fox News. He's going at it.
Right. So
Now,
that
now Clinton, as we know, nothing stopped that guy. He's ready for a second for 8 years with Hillary. You can't stop the guy. He's every bone in his body is political. What did Barack Obama do when he ended his term of office? Ask yourself. He doesn't say anything. He has no interest in politics. He threw a 60th birthday bash and he disinvited the political people to keep the Hollywood people. There's a difference there. Right. Obama had no interest. He has no interest in politics. He's a stupefying narcissist. He always was a stupefying narcissist. But he had no interest in the actual stuff of politics. And so when he was elected, listen, when you read Carter's memoir, the word that came in relief for me is every few pages, he would say, I studied this for 8 weeks. I studied this for 2 months. You could see the intensity. Carter was known as a micromanager. The intensity with which he invested in his office. He was very serious about being the president of the United States. And there's an intensity which I didn't like his policies. I did not like Camp David. I did not like, frankly, anything he did, but I have to respect him, as I do Charles Schumer, for the intensity of their commitment to their calling and the seriousness with which they take it. Now, you read what I had to write. You read what I wrote, or at least the first draft. You will recall there was a very critical decision that had to be made on the banks, on the solvency of the banks. And Axelrod, his campaign strategist, who then became his senior advisor in the White House, Axelrod describes what happened. He says Obama called down Geithner, Summers, and Romer, the three key people handling financial and economic. Christy Romer, I guess is the name. The three critical people. He says, look, I'm tired of your quarreling. I'm going to get a haircut. And while I'm getting my haircut, I want you to reach a consensus. And when I come back, you better have a consensus. I
Well,
mean, is that
yeah.
that's how he
So,
described it. And you know, what's amazing when you read these people is the complete lack of self-awareness, the memoirists, of what they're describing. Plouffe says, okay, we have the hype, meaning Obama has a lot of hype. Now, I wish I don't have the quotes directly in front of me, but you have, I could see your attention is very high, so you'll remember. Plouffe says, okay, now we have to figure out a platform for him.
yeah, I mean those anecdotes are really, I think, do a really great job of pointing to how even the people who are attempting to praise him in these biographies are unwittingly revealing a lot about the shallowness of his
It was
engagement.
just
The
breathtaking. The
reason,
guy, David Litt, he says, if you want to read a really brilliant speech by Obama, read the one that was written by Terry. You know, whatever the speech. I mean,
right.
you can't make
So,
this stuff up. You
yeah, so
can't make it up.
the idea being that, Obama has all these speechwriters, he has policymakers, and he's doing very little on his own. But the reason why I pushed back against the characterization of him as not a political person or not being good at politics is because for so many people, they don't care because he was so obviously good at this other aspect
Yeah.
of political performance, which you might not choose to describe as politics, but I think a lot of people really do because, frankly, I wouldn't expect anybody, the most knowledgeable, savvy politico in the world, to be an expert on every subject. And when
Absolutely.
I'm thinking about picking a president or a leader in any capacity, I think a lot of people think, well, what's really important is that he can assemble a good team of people around him and can make good analytical choices. And first and foremost, have a solid base of principle that's guiding the choices
Oh,
between the various policies that are
I'm
put
listening.
before him.
I'm
So
listening
the
to every
reason,
word you're saying, and I just have
but just if
problems
I
with
could,
everything. What does it mean to say a good team,
but
assemble a good team of people?
right.
If
And
you're, if
I want
you're
to
not,
get,
if you're going to just be the communicator of the team, then it makes a very big difference if your team consists of all these establishment figures who've been
right.
around.
Of course. Of course. But the point I'm just trying to
And
make,
then
though,
you
really
say, and then
quickly,
you say,
Professor
but then,
Finkelstein,
and
the
then
only
you
point I'm trying to
say,
make, if I could just wrap this one point up, Professor Finkelstein,
yeah,
the only point I want to make
norms.
is that the reason I think this is important, and I want to make this point so we can get off this subject, to be honest. But the reason I want to make this point is that when you say something like Barack Obama is not a good politician, you are losing a huge part of your
Never
potential
say,
audience, or he's not political, or he's not good at politics.
right.
You are going to lose a big part of your audience who is interpreting what that means very differently from
I,
you. And my concern is this is such a sensitive area, but an important thing for people to realize and talk about, that I would prefer not to alienate people by speaking in
because
what are perhaps overly broad terms.
I think there's just confusion here. I don't really much care if somebody is a good politician. David Axelrod made a career out of selling people. That's his job. He's a used car salesman in the field of in the arena of politics. He takes anybody who comes along and he fits them out. He says, "My job is messaging." And yes, you could be a good campaign manager and strategist, but to me, that's not politics. That
Right.
that's marketing. Now,
And that's
marketing.
fine, but for a lot of people that is politics. That's
Yeah, but
it.
not for me, and not for what people's expectations. Army that was organized in the expectation that there would be dramatic change under Obama. And
So
it
to me
was,
that's the important part, right? Like
and there was
the
the failed expectations
yeah.
were in no small part what ushered in Donald Trump, because
Right.
they
So
had one verbal prestidigitator namely Obama, who promised hope and change. When that proved to be a complete fake, they looked for another one, and they found it in another outsider. He wasn't an outsider because of his race. He was an outsider because he was uncouth. He was the representative of the basket of deplorables.
Right. So isn't that proof then, Professor Finkelstein? I mean, the issue then isn't that Barack Obama wasn't better at politics as you're defining them, because you've listed a whole bunch of other people whose substantive political journey you would disagree with wholeheartedly. You point to Dick Cheney as someone who's a real politician,
No.
Bill Clinton as someone who's a real politician.
Cheney's body was political. He couldn't.
Right. So I guess the point that I'm making is, when we're making these criticisms of Barack Obama, the critique of Barack Obama, my question, I guess, is how much does it matter? Like, of what relevance is it really that he was a bad politician? Isn't the issue, in fact, that he didn't have these underlying political principles, that he used his rhetorical ability and all of his speechwriters and et cetera to push towards some greater good? Would I care at all that he's not a good politician if he was using it for good purposes? And I think that's important, because I think there are a lot of people. To me, the problem is
we're at cross purposes.
How so?
Because you keep referring to whether or not he's a good politician. I don't care if somebody is a good politician. Barack Obama became the poster child for identity politics. He was the purified, the distilled, the refined expression of identity politics. And what that phenomenon revealed was that there was nothing in the vessel. There was no politics. It was just one of the most, I found, astonishing statements. The best biography of Obama, and really the only biography of Obama, is the one written by David Garrow called Rising Star.
It's right there in the background.
It's 1,500 pages, and the last 300 pages are double column endnotes. And
right.
He goes through every statement Obama ever uttered. And what is his conclusion on the very last page? If you pull it off your shelf and you look at the very last page, like page 1200 of the text, and there are the 300 pages of endnotes, he said, there was nothing there. He said, the vessel was empty. And that, to me, is not just an indictment of Obama. It's a devastating indictment of identity politics.
I think that's right. And we should pivot to identity politics. But you said that you don't care whether or not Barack Obama is a good politician or a good political mind, or however you want to frame it. But I bring it up because you spend a lot of time in this chapter talking about all the ways that Barack Obama is an intellectual failure when it comes to his political base. So, for example, you talk about several people who have lauded him as being this great intellect and having this amazing grasp of all kinds of materials, including physics, et cetera. And you spend a considerable amount of time. For example, you write, of the Jewish genius Masure's in Obama's life, the distinction of most preposterous probably belonged to Lawrence Tribe of Harvard Law School. He went so far as to rave about Obama's, quote, deep insight into physics. In subsequent correspondence with this writer, Tribe elaborated on the, quote, rapidity and depth with which he picked up subtle concepts in physics, from the core ideas of general relativity to the competing interpretations of quantum physics. And going on and on about how, he's likely an affirmative action hire, that it's unlikely that he, the kind of narrative of him being the first Black
president of Harvard Law Review,
president of Harvard Law Review, isn't really reflective of kind of like hard work, gumption, or intellect. And that is it's a part and parcel of the pitch that you're making here in this piece. And so I don't necessarily, I quibble with some parts of it. For example, my understanding of how you make law review is that it is an intellectual exercise. You can't, there's no shortcuts. There's no affirmative action for Harvard Law Review. There's two ways to get on. You can default on through your grades. If you're in the top of your class, you default on, or a smaller number of people can get on via a writing competition, which is difficult. It is a timed, you go, I know because I didn't actually try, but to stay in your dorm an extra week at the end of the year, you can like say that you're going to do it. So I went and picked up the materials, and it's this huge stack that's like a foot high of paper, and you have a set amount of time to do a subsiding portion, which is like an editing portion, and then a kind of like a more substantive exam, a writing portion. And either you can do it or you don't. Either you pass or you don't, and it's extremely competitive, as you might imagine. So I would quibble with those aspects of it, but the focus on Obama's mind, his political mind, and his appetite for a real politic isn't something that I'm bringing up. It's something that I am bringing up to you right now because it is a real focus of your piece.
Okay.
And I'm questioning what purpose that piece serves other than to alienate people who I think would be very receptive to the other part of your argument, which is that he was a Trojan horse that really wasn't the progressive that he was sold as.
Brianna, first of all, I don't care about alienating people. I don't say that with I'm not being cavalier about it. I'm interested in truth. And
okay, well then.
I want to ask you something, Brianna.
Sure.
Okay. You're a perfectly intelligent woman. You went to Harvard. I guess your degree is in art history, and then you went to
history of science and art history, joint concentration.
Right. Okay. I can't remember now. Excuse me. Do you think somebody who took one course in physics for poets, do you think he had deep insights into quantum physics?
Absolutely not. And
okay, wait. Allow me. I'm not cross-examining you. Let's just go through the facts. I once went, and I was quite close friends for a large period of my life with Professor Chomsky. I once went on a long car ride with him, and you don't shoot the bull with Professor Chomsky. You always have to be serious. But I was asking him some questions. So I said, "What's your opinion on Einstein's theory of relativity? Is it really in a class all its own as compared to other physics?" I never forgot his response to me. He said, "Well, I really wouldn't know because there are only a handful of people in the world who even understand Einstein's theory of relativity." And then I read that Barack Obama, according to Lawrence Tribe, that and Remnick writes it also in his book, that he took one course, physics for poets, no math courses, but he has deep insight into relativity and quantum physics. Now, you're an intelligent young woman. Does that sound plausible to you?
It doesn't. And I really want to be clear about
Let's go further. Does that sound ridiculous to you?
Of course, but there's no need to move this because we're in complete agreement over this, Professor Finkelstein.
What I was doing there is to show how this cult was created. This totally preposterous cult by all these Jewish liberals. Exactly what Cornel West, Cornel West, one of the advantages to Cornel West is he knows that milieu inside out. He knows those people. And he said Obama liked to surround himself with these white Jewish geniuses like Larry Summers. He had a very good expression. He described people like Larry Summers with their, quote, truncated brilliance. And I could understand what he was trying to convey there, that they have obviously a certain knack and gift for, say, mathematics, but there's something missing in their persons, this truncated brilliance.
Yes, I'm very familiar with the half intellects and partial personalities of people who tend to occupy places like Harvard University. Right. So no people there.
That particular point in the manuscript, I was talking about mostly white Jewish liberals who created Obama. The
What
focus,
what
the
is the
focus,
relevance for
but
you of what relevance is the Jewishness there? Because it's something that
there
comes
is,
up.
there is something there. There's something there. How do you explain it? You sent me that question. I agree. I'm pretty good at anticipating questions by close readers, and that was a sharp question. What exactly is it? I can't say, but there is certainly this kind of Martha's Vineyard white Jewish liberal phenomenon. We're trying to prove how cool and chill and down they are with the hood. And it was a phenomenon already, you could see it in 1960s. As you probably know, Tom Wolfe immortalized it in this little memoir of attending Leonard Bernstein's fundraiser for the Black Panthers in his suite. And all the white liberals are there, people like Jean Stein, the mother of Katrina vanden Heuvel, and also a very wealthy woman and a nice woman. I knew her. There's a scene that Tom Wolfe depicts that makes me cringe to this day of Leonard Bernstein high-fiving the Panther. You know, there is that it's so liberal, so patronizing, so condescending. Wow, Barack Obama can write a sentence and he's got the subject and predicate in the right order. He must be a genius. And it was interesting when I read Du Bois, as you know, had 3 memoirs. And also, if you read David Levering Lewis's really magisterial biography of Du Bois, very impressive. Du Bois never liked to be around these white liberals because he had that intuition that as much as they said how smart he was, he knew they were condescending to him. So he had very few white friends. He liked Joel Spingarn, in the NAACP, but in general, it's a type, and it's a type which you're familiar with.
I am, and I really do want to get to that part of the
They were your professors.
right. But my question was
Mhm.
specifically, and maybe there's not a good answer for it right now. But my question was specifically, you don't, that's a phenomenon that I've seen among white liberals from here till eternity, right? It's not a
Not
phenomenon
just
that I
white
would
liberals, it's white
specifically.
Jewish liberals. If
Well,
you
but
look
that's what I'm asking
If
you
you
is
look at the
because
main
my
supporters of
but
Obama at Harvard Law School, Frug, Minnow, Tribe, there is a pattern. There is
but
a pattern.
what do you make of that pattern? Because my experience, it might just be that were more, you know,
I
uh,
didn't notice any
an
non. Yeah,
overrepresentation of Jewish professors or faculty
there
members or
is.
what have you that
Yes,
made that the case.
that's
But do
true.
you actually you raise their Jewishness in your text as though it is relevant to
Well,
their attachment to Barack Obama? And I wondered if
there
you had
is.
interrogated that at
Well,
all.
historically, there's always been a special relationship between Jews in the civil rights movement and African Americans. And there has been that liberal Jewish ethos, which I find it like, I find it very phony. I grew up with these people. I know them. I know it. I went through it. I remember I had 2 friends in high school, Stephen Schlossberg and Peter Addison, and they wanted to go into the Ivy Leagues. They didn't make it, though. They both ended up very rich doctors, very rich. And they were um, into golf. No, they were into tennis, and golf.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the question came up at that point. This is my high school years. There were no black tennis players. Arthur Ashe hadn't yet come along, and there were no black golfers. Obviously, Tiger Woods hadn't come along. And the question became, why are there no blacks in tennis and golf? Because those were the Ivy League sports. If you were applying to the Ivy League schools, you wanted to be in the golf team and the tennis team. And I remember they say because tennis and golf require intelligence.
Right. Well, I mean, tennis and golf require tennis courts and golf courses, which is a pretty significant issue. But
that is the mindset. I'll give you an example from a woman I like very much.
But Professor,
allow me to finish. Nadine Strassen, the former head of the ACLU, went to Harvard Law School and Harvard Law Review. Very nice woman. Very nice woman. I like her very much. She actually, in her last book, she acknowledged me because I helped. So I was shocked. No one ever mentions my name in books. It's like, red flag to a book. And so she was kind enough. I didn't need it, but I was appreciative. In any case, I invited her once. I used to teach a course at the local library because I wasn't allowed to teach anymore. So I organized a course at night at Grand Army Plaza Library, which is the main library in Brooklyn, New York. And I taught freedom of speech, issues pertaining to freedom of speech. And I invited Nadine Strassen because she was the former chair of the ACLU, and she had just come out with a book on free speech. And she starts going on about how every word out of Barack Obama's mouth is so brilliant, and it's such genius, and I could never disagree with anything. What the fuck is this? I have never read or heard a single word out of Barack Obama's mouth that wasn't a cliche. What are you talking about? It's so painful to listen to this drivel. It's so patronizing, so condescending. He's not a genius. There's no evidence of that. If you read Garrow's book, now you said you were a student there. I'm going to speak to you now as somebody who taught. I can't call myself a professor. I never made it. I have to be honest about that. But I taught. When you have a student, and Brianna, I'm going to ask you to be honest. It may be offensive what I have to say, but I don't really care. I'm not out to please. I'm out as best as I can to approach truth. It may or it may not please. When you're a professor, you have a student. He's always showing up at office hours. He's always schmoozing with you. He's always talking in class. In fact, he talks so much, the students contrive what they call an Obama monitor because of his pretentious and nonstop talking. And he has this strategy, which he works out with his friend, Rob Fisher. Rob Fisher was apparently a very smart guy. That's what David Garrow tells me. I can't confirm or deny. But Fisher comes to Harvard Law already with his PhD in economics from Duke University. And he knows quite a lot, apparently. That's what Garrow tells me. They devised this test-taking strategy. Now listen to the test-taking strategy. Obama used these locutions in class. He always used the locution folks. We folks, we folks. Mm-hmm. So it was intimately connected with him. And they said they would use these locutions on the exams. So the professor would know who was writing the exam. So you have the schmoozer, you have the talker, you have the person who you know who's great, whose paper you're grading. Mm-hmm. And then, Brianna, you have this liberal Jewish type. When you add up that, I know the pressure that's exerted on you as a professor, not from the outside, it's from the inside. The pressure to give the guy an A. I know it. Ask me if I've done it. Answer, yes, because I have that liberal Jewish
Yeah,
bone in my body.
but but I'm not arguing. I'm not arguing.
I'm saying it's a fake.
Right, right, right. But I really want to hear you because I feel like you're objecting to me as though I'm making one case and I'm not saying that at all. So I want to finish my point so that you are not making a case against me that you don't need to make because I agree with you entirely. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
The point that I'm making, and you can say, you can do the reality TV thing and say, I'm not here to make friends and I don't care who likes this or reads this or cares. But I have a different project, and your project and my project don't have to be the same project. But I don't see any valor in saying I don't care what people think about X, Y, and Z, because I am a political person, and so far as my political project is communication, I want people to come to a mutual understanding with me so that we can have our eyes open and be aware the next time someone tries to force another Obama down our throat, or the next time Obama comes out of the woodwork to do something like what you write about, and I want to get to, derailing Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign. And so for me, when I read your piece and there are all these really valid criticisms about how we overestimated his rhetorical skill so that he could go on and ultimately throw us under the bus and disguise the extent to which there was no political substance there. I think that is such a crucial point for people to really understand. And many of the anecdotes you described go to setting up and making that point very convincingly. But there's another set of anecdote that I think does not serve that purpose. It just seems more like a generalized attack on his intellect or ability that I think could serve to distract an audience who might be very willing to say, oh, yes, this is how Obama pulled the wool over our eyes. Let me get smarter and grow and learn from this experience, to be in a defensive posture. And I say that because I'm someone who certainly has absolutely no love for Barack Obama. But there were, when you read something like the Harvard Law Review anecdote, that's what starts to make it have the veneer of a vendetta and like a personal issue, as opposed to an accounting, which is trying to serve the purpose of illuminating the extent to which Obama was a false flag for progressivism. Do you see what I'm saying?
I hear what you're saying, and I've gotten that criticism from other people. I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to give you a frank answer.
Sure.
First of all, I am a political person. I do try to convince. I read a lot. I spent a whole summer. It's my Obama summer. It is. I went to Amazon. I ordered about 15 huge volumes. I said, I'll never be able to do this. I'll never be able to do this. I'll never be able to do this. Well, I did it. So why would I do all that research if I wasn't aiming to convince? I never skim. It's not my style. I read every word, including the footnotes, appendices, always since I was a kid. I don't know why, because I never had a feeling of fulfillment. If I had a book on the shelf and I want to claim I read it, I had to feel like I read it. Else, if I pointed to someone, I'd feel like I was lying if I said I read it, if I hadn't read every word. That's just my style. So of course I'm out to convince. However, what does it mean to convince? I think the Obama phenomenon, I have no interest in Obama as a person. I don't find him very interesting. He likes sports, good for him. Every minute of every day he has free, he's watching ESPN. Good for him, that's his thing. I don't find him interesting. I have no interest, whatever his speeches, well, they're not even his speeches, but quote unquote his speeches. They're just bubblegum. But the phenomenon is actually in many ways quite shocking. It was a complete swindle and scam. It was, to me, I have to say, the more I read, the more shocked I actually was that they pulled this off.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about a little bit, if we
And I would
can,
just want to just
the
say what
2000
I'm
and
going to just let me enter not a footnote, but just an aside. It was very interesting to watch who pulled it off. When he establishes his first campaign team, it's Plouffe, Axelrod, and Gibbs. They're all white. Then he assembles the team of writers. He has 8 writers. And Litt makes the point, they're all white males. It's very striking. Wouldn't it strike you?
Yes, and it has.
Yeah, of 8 writers, 8, including around 3 who just did comedy sketches because he was going on like, the Washington Press Club comedy night, they had. He couldn't find one black writer to do comedy.
Yeah, I think that was a really interesting point that you made, that apparently none of the black comedians kind of passed muster to join the team. And yes, it's something that people have commented on, and that, as I listen to the kind of Crooked Media podcast family, where a whole lot of people have very lucrative careers now as the host of Pod Save America, et cetera, because they were his speechwriters. And thinking about how none of those opportunities befall any black people or any women, in part because that's not who Barack Obama chose to keep around him and put words in his mouth. It's really striking.
In his inner circle, there were 2 blacks. Valerie Jarrett, who for all intents and purposes might as well have been white.
Well, why do you say that, Professor Finkelstein?
Well, first of all, Valerie Jarrett, just physically, let's start with the physically, okay?
But that's been never how race operates in America.
Okay, let's start there. I didn't say finish there. When her child was born, the hospital administrator put the child down as white.
I went to law school with her child, in fact, actually. One of the most notable moments I was very quiet 1L year. She was a year or 2 ahead of me. And one of the most notable moments of my 1L experience was Professor Feldman, who's in the news for other reasons than not so charmingly right now, called on her and called her Mrs. Gray, which is about the biggest impression I ever made on anybody in that class.
And she grew up, and actually her mother, when her mother gave birth to her, the administrator put down white. So just at that level. But you're right. That's you can call it a trivial level because we have the 1-drop rule in the United States. Okay.
Correct.
She had nothing to do with black people.
Why do you say that?
Well, because she was the mascot for Richard Daley. When the Richard Daley administration came along in Chicago, he appointed her in every board. She was the head of the Chicago Housing Authority. She was the head of the Chicago Transit Authority. She was the head of the chair of the stock exchange. They just used her for everything. When she was the head of, then she became part of this Habitat company, a private public cooperative. She was a one-person gentrification machine.
So
she
I think
destroyed all the black neighborhoods in Chicago.
But that's different. I challenge the idea that you said, quote, she has nothing to do with black people. But this is the thing. All I do is sit around critiquing identity politics all day. It's a very different.
When she is the only representative of black people in his inner circle. She is the only one, except for Reggie Love.
Right, I understand that, but you can't. That is not the same thing. The problem with Valerie Jarrett is that she doesn't have good politics that connect with what the bulk of black voters want and need. Not because she's light-skinned, right? That's not the issue. And not because of what her personal connection is. No, and it's also not because you said she has nothing to do with black people. I know nothing about her personal life, who she hangs out with, how she grew up, or how much she has anything to do with black people. So what I'm not disagreeing with the substance of your critique of Valerie Jarrett, but I'm just cautioning you to be careful, especially since you aren't black, frankly.
It's something that's who he chose. It's right. Something. The leading black intellectual in the United States is, I think, clearly, hands down, it is Cornel West. And it's very striking that Obama couldn't find any place for Cornel West in his administration. That tells me something. It tells me something. But he finds a place for Valerie Jarrett, and the only other person is Reggie Love. And Reggie Love, he was the gopher. Oh, Obama wants an exotic meal. Can you get it for him? Oh, Obama needs a new pair of shoes. Can you get it for him? That's all Reggie Love did. I liked Reggie Love's memoir because he didn't give a. He used the memoir to talk about himself, which I kind of liked, even though, of course, there's the praise for Obama. But it tells you something. I don't know why you wouldn't want to see that. That the person he chose was Valerie Jarrett.
I don't think that you are hearing what my criticism is.
Does it bother you that Valerie Jarrett sings the praises of Al Sharpton?
Yes, that is a substantive critique of Valerie Jarrett. Valerie Jarrett being light-skinned, her daughter being perceived as white as a kid, it derails the rest of your argument. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's not helpful. I'm telling you, as someone who is sympathetic to your argument and who is perhaps the person outside of the Reeds who has written most critique of identity politics on the left, that there are aspects of what is written here that even alienate me and force me into a defensive posture that is unnecessary.
Listen,
you can choose not to care, Professor Finkelstein. That's completely your right.
Valerie,
but we could be talking about the substantive things that we agree with, but we keep getting derailed because of these kind of asides I'm sorry, if I could just finish the sentence. That do open you up to, I think, legitimate criticism that this isn't about the substance, but it's about a personal animus for Barack Obama. And I personally don't have a personal animus for Barack Obama beyond the extent to which he has failed to stand up for the promises that he made to the American people who are suffering at a historic level right now. And particularly because he's a Black person who traded on his Blackness in order to convince people without a lot of substance, as you've written so persuasively, to invest in him and to trust him with the future and the fate of the most historically marginal, one of the most historically marginalized groups in this country. That is my beef with Barack Obama. But when you say things like, I don't find him interesting, that's fine. You don't have to. I personally find him to be very interesting and deeply compelling. And I mean, like, the whole phenomenon I find to be fascinating. But it begs the question, why is it relevant whether you find him interesting and I find him uninteresting?
I said I don't think it's relevant.
But it comes up. You said it. I didn't say it. You said it. And those kinds of asides and those frolics and detours I would put to you, set you up to be written off and set all of your critique to be written off as a personal vendetta, as opposed to a substantive analysis, which I think is very much here. And that's all that it is that I'm flagging.
Because I don't like identity politics.
Why not?
Why?
Yeah. I mean, I don't either, but I want to hear, I'm interested in hearing your analysis.
Because I know enough young people, not from the elite schools, but young people who are struggling very hard now. I had a wonderful life, not in terms of professional success, but in terms of being able to do with my life what I wanted to do. You set a goal as a child, a youth, and then you are able to realize it. I had a friend, Richard Herskowitz. He loved film. He became a film impresario, organizing festivals. Larry Spivak, he was in the school band, the orchestra leader. He became the leader of the Greenwich Orchestra. Then there's the whole slew who became doctors. That was their goal. And then there were quite a few who made just money in Wall Street. This generation, it's the very rare person outside the 20%. The 20% will make it. The 80% who I know, they're not going to see anything in their lives. It's very hard for me to tell them that. often they ask me, what do you think I should do? Where do you think I should go? I don't even know what to counsel anymore because I don't see any prospects at all. So to me, this identity politics, it's a complete and total diversion from anything meaningful and substantive for the young people I know who are poor, who live 4 to a room in New York or 4 to an apartment in New York, who struggle each month to make the rent, who keep down 3 dead-end jobs with no job security, no vacation, no sick benefits, nothing. And then juxtaposed to that is this idiotic identity politics, which, so far as the young people I know, has absolutely no meaning, no substance whatsoever. And
So I just want to make sure I understand
let me just, one last thought.
Sure.
It was very striking to me the juxtaposition of the Obama campaign with the Bernie campaign. The Obama campaign was just elect Obama. It was just all focused on electing this person president. The Bernie campaign was entirely focused on his platform. Everybody, the moment you thought Bernie, you thought first Medicare for all, abolish student debt, abolish tuition, jobs, and infrastructure. It was an identity politics campaign juxtaposed against a class politics. It was a very, in my opinion, a very striking juxtaposition. Most people liked Bernie, not because they had any particular affection for him, but because they trusted him. They knew this guy's been in politics for 40 years. He's been saying the same thing since the 1970s. So they figure, okay, the guy is the real thing. He's the real deal. That's the kind of politics that's always interested me. I care about the fate of humanity. I do. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't much care about Ibram X. Kendi's hair. It doesn't much interest me. These are fashion shows. This is not scholarship. It's not politics. It's Tamika Mallory doing Cadillac commercials. Mm-hmm. It's Patrice Cullors buying her 4 homes and then taking the money and run. It's also beyond the scam. It's really destructive. I was out every night during the George Floyd demonstrations. I was the only one over, there was nobody over 30 at the demonstrations because it was during COVID. So I was the only one, not from my age cohort, I was on for 4 decades, after 35, 3 decades. And what was most striking to me, a veteran, as it were, of demonstrations, I had never seen such anger among the whites, the young white people. It was not this kind of noblesse oblige solidarity with Black people. No, it was solidarity. However, it was, we're all in this together. And it was very striking. Let's say the Barclays Center, which is the big center in downtown Brooklyn. Here were the cops lined up, and here were the demonstrators. And there would be the white women. And there was such a fierce anger. They were screaming. It was not the most sophisticated of slogans, but they were shouting, NYPD, suck my dick. NYPD, so angry. And you could see it was the rage against the machine, that the police were the symbols of this whole system that left them with no future, a futureless future. And there was real potential there.
Mm-hmm.
It was real black and white solidarity as I had never before seen it. And it was very inspiring to see it because it wasn't fake. It wasn't the Martha's Vineyard.
It wasn't performative.
It was real. Because a lot of these kids, how do you find a place in New York? There are 3 people, they need a roommate. So a person comes along, they randomly choose them. There isn't like a co-op screening, you know what I mean? So you have every different type living together. A black person, a white person, a gay person, a trans person, they're all living together. There was a real sense of community there, recognition that blacks were getting shafted more than everybody else, but we're all getting shafted by this system.
Mm-hmm.
And the identity politics wrecks all that. It destroys it by balkanizing the solidarity, creating this competitiveness. Who is the most oppressed among the group? Who should get bumped to the head of the queue? It's such a destructive politics. I was a Maoist in my youth. I made many errors. I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge them. But there were things about that period that I look back and they make sense. Mao's famous slogan was, "Unite the many to defeat the few." Unite the many to defeat the few. The slogan of identity politics is, disunite the many to enable the few, to create enough divisions, fragmentations, and so forth. It's a very destructive. And at the end, of course, the whole identity politics in the George Floyd demonstrations, what happened? Instead of putting forth a slogan which could have united people, the obvious slogan was justice, meaning justice against the cops, and jobs, because all these people don't have work. Instead of justice and jobs, it came to pummeling statues of whomever they were pulling down. And if you attended those demonstrations, I don't know if you did, by the third week, the first week it was 50-50, 50% black, 50% not black. By the third week, it was about 80-10, 80% white. The black people sort of isn't going anywhere. And they started to disappear. And then the whole craziness with the statues started. And then the whole thing just fizzled out.
Right. Well, I think that there's a lot to be said about those protests, and we've said some of it on the show. I would dispute that it fizzled out. I think that there were a lot of things that happened. There was the media turned on the protests and started characterizing them as kind of unhinged and violent, and that the ongoing protests were a direct, there was going to be a direct trade-off between the George Floyd movement, policing movement, and Joe Biden's electoral chances, and that deflated some energy out of it. And there was an unwillingness of figureheads, as you've pointed to actually stick that landing and use it for any real leverage in an electoral context in the middle of a general election. And there was a lot going on there. But I want to bring this back to the subject at hand and ask you then, in a broader critique of identity politics, why is it that you felt the need to write a chapter on Barack Obama, especially if, to your point, the younger generations, let's say the under 40 crowd, is pretty woke and hip to the failures of Obama, and doesn't need the pitch? Who is this? Who is this for?
Yeah, that part, I didn't actually say it to you now, and I don't think it's in the manuscript, but that part I think is correct. I talked to the young people, and they recognize, when I say young, I'm talking about the age cohort, let's say between 20 and 33, something around there. Not yet 35, but age cohort 20 to 33. And one
I
guy,
get it. I'm not young anymore. It's okay,
no, I have
Professor
no idea how
Finkelstein.
old you are. I'm just saying that, yes, there's a recognition that it was a historical event, him becoming president. But beyond that fact, as one person said it, Timothy Davis, very smart young man, he said, we're looking for substance. Our generation is looking for substance, or our age
Hmm.
cohort. Uh, so I agree with you. That's why I don't agree there's going to be a return of the Obama phenomenon. I don't. I think it's exhausted itself. He still exercises figurehead power in the Democratic Party. He's called out for things like South Carolina, and he obliges. But otherwise, he's not much interested in politics, and he doesn't have that persuasive power among a certain generation anymore. The generation that he mobilized to get elected in 2008.
Well,
2000,
what do you think is going to happen going forward? Do you think the Democratic Party is going to realize quickly enough that identity politics doesn't have the same um, influence? It can't be
well,
weaponized in the
I'm
same.
talking about a specific age cohort. There's still a large cohort
Right. So
that
what
doesn't.
I'm at,
Mhm.
yeah. So what I'm asking is, what do you think is going to happen going forward? Because it does seem like they're teeing up some combination of Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, and Amy Klobuchar for 2024, 2028. And I think the idea is that there is a certain amount of traction they still expect to get out of identity politics. And I want to be really clear. When I say, when I critique identity politics, what I'm critiquing is a weaponization of identity politics, not the idea and fact of there being discrete identities that coalition built along those lines for oftentimes very good historical reasons. Black Lives Matter protest is an identity based protest. It's explicit. It's in the name. So, what do you have thoughts and feelings about how the Democratic Party is going to respond to younger voters not kind of falling for the rigmarole the way they have in the past? You think they haven't even noticed?
It's hard to say because, as you know, Brianna, one of the big disappointments of the Bernie campaign is he couldn't get those people to vote.
Well, nobody can. Young voters don't vote. So at the end of the
So,
day, isn't this pitch? Is this all about? Should we be all be trying to talk to an
so I'm not
older
sure.
audience?
I'm not sure whether the Democratic Party is going to much care what young people think because they didn't come out to vote. It was the two age cohorts, the three cohorts that Bernie lost were young people, and a large part of his campaign was premised on he can turn out a large number of young people like Obama did in 2008 to vote. It didn't work. The baby boomer generation, complete disaster because they're so selfish. It was an unfortunate vindication of the right wing attacks during the counterculture period during the 60s, which said these baby boomers are selfish, self absorbed, the me generation. And I was obviously indignant at that, but in retrospect, it turned out to be the case. The
Well,
baby,
yeah.
the 60 plus generation, my generation, Bernie got at best about 14% of the vote. And basically, it was because who cares about Medicare for all? We already have Medicare. Who cares about abolishing student debt? We have no student debt. Who cares about abolishing
Mm.
student tuition? We don't pay student tuition. And who cares about climate change? We'll be dead before the planet is.
Well, I have a slightly different analysis there. I don't have a fatalistic view of baby boomers, and I wouldn't essentialize them in quite that way and say they are kind of categorically selfish. What I would say is that the campaign didn't reach out to them even a little bit, not once, not at all. There were no voter drives at nursing homes. There was no senior outreach. There were no ads that targeted seniors. There was no discussion of the fact that seniors are the fastest growing group that have student debt and have the Social Security checks garnished for student debt payments. There was no discussion of how Medicare for All was going to expand Medicare to include hearing, dental, and vision outside of Bernie saying that in the context of stump speeches and town halls and debates. So I'm not willing to say that it is a kind of constitutional failure of an entire generation when these campaigns have done very little to actually try to organize that cohort. But it does beg the question: if all of this pitch, if the wake up call about identity politics and all of that really needs to be targeted to an older generation and a more diverse generation, because like all of the critique of Bernie for not reaching out to Black voters or not connecting with Black voters, it was only older Black voters, right? So we're talking about an older, generally, and also Blacker subset.
I'm personally a little skeptical of that argument. You were closer to it than me, so obviously I have to defer to your perceptions. But if you remember, in the last week of South Carolina, some of the polls were showing Bernie would win.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was trounced.
Mm-hmm.
So the issue then became Clyburn's endorsement, which about 60% of those exiting said was a crucial component in their decision. And the fact that in the background, it loomed that Obama was supporting Biden.
Yeah.
But I'm not convinced. Let's just take a simple, which I don't think is far-fetched. Remember that...
You're not convinced of what? I'm sorry.
Right, I want to get to it. You remember Clyburn was holding back on any endorsement that last week before the screws are obviously turned on him. He has to endorse Biden. Let's take a hypothetical. Let's say Clyburn had endorsed Bernie. Let's take another hypothetical. Obama had endorsed Bernie. I think all those so-called conservative Black voters, I think 90% of them would have voted for Bernie.
I think so too, but I'm not sure what that does.
Because the issue was not that they're conservative. The issue was...
I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't dispute any of that. But the point that I was just trying to make was that if Bernie failed because he doesn't have Clyburn's endorsement, because he doesn't have Barack Obama's endorsement to get that part of the population, then isn't the pitch of what you've basically written, assuming that you have a goal of continuing to open people's eyes and to prevent kind of the hoodwinking that Obama was able to effect, isn't this supposed to be pitched to that? Isn't this ostensibly being pitched to that group? And if it is being pitched to that group, older Americans and a Blacker cohort of Americans, and if that's the people who really need to understand the narrative that you've set out here and understand the history that you've set out here, I think so compellingly, isn't that some cause? And I don't mean to keep bringing it back to this, but that is the reason why I, am just cautious about some of the tone. If you're going to make an argument that one of the Black public figures that they have the most pride in, not just unknowledgeable at some subjects, but lacking in a certain intellectual rigor, then you really got to make sure you have your ducks in a row if you want the rest of your argument to fly. So that's the only reason. I don't think I need to say that again, but thank you again, Professor Finkelstein, for joining me today.
Okay. Nice to talk to you.
Look, I mean, this is obviously, not exactly what we anticipated going into this conversation. I don't think this is what necessarily Norm Finkelstein anticipated either. I think we decided to have this conversation because we have an enormous amount of respect for each other. And I was really humbled by the way that he reached out to me and wanted me to look over this chapter of this book that he's working on that I think means a lot to him. And I think he reached out to me in part because I have a reputation on the left as someone who has her own critique of weaponized identity politics, and who he thought could provide a non-reactive view or review of his critique of Obama, without having a knee-jerk defense of him as like a Black man and a first, the way a lot of liberals do.
Right.
And like I said on the episode, I agree with like 95% of his critique of Obama. And there were so many so much interesting evidence that regrettably didn't get all brought out onto the table in the course of the conversation because we ran out of time and got caught up in other things. But a lot of interesting evidence about all of the ways in which people do seem to have kind of fluffed Obama's, you know, experiences and, you know, performance in various contexts in order to satisfy a narrative that I think ultimately benefits a certain kind of white liberal who likes to feel good about praising a black man. I think that is true.
Yeah, and I think part of his objection is he finds that very paternalistic and noxious as a result.
Totally.
Yeah.
I'm totally there. But, you know, this is a thing that came up when we had Adolph Reed on the show as well, which is, who is this for? And is your critique reaching the people who need to hear it? And it's not that I intend to do any apologia for Barack Obama. I don't think that anyone can be mistaken for believing that I'm a big Obama fan. However, you know, the question I always ask is, what's the point of this? What are we driving to? Like, what is the political purpose of this? And I understand that everyone doesn't have necessarily that goal, and other people can have different projects. And one's project could be to just kind of cathartically voice your irritations and concerns about Barack Obama. And I guess that has its time and place, but I don't see that to be particularly politically useful. It's not necessarily the kind of thing that I would want to make space for here.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely do have different projects. Like we chatted about this a little bit ago. Like, you know, you seek always to persuade. That's like integral to your political project. And he said multiple times that ultimately he's sort of seeking like a capital T truth. Right.
And I would argue that it is not a truth. I mean, we don't have to belabor this, but it is not a truth that, you know, that Obama is not as intellectually rigorous as some other people he pointed to, like Chuck Schumer or what have you.
Noted genius Chuck Schumer, yes.
You know, and the thing was, you know, and I want to be really fair to Norm Finkelstein here, because, you know, his point is that, and we had some follow-up conversation after this, but his point is that he was also hard on any number of other people in the chapter, and that's absolutely true. He was hard on Samantha Powers. He called a lot of people a lot of names, and I don't think that he signaled out Barack Obama for undue criticism, except for, or signaled out Barack Obama for criticism differently than other people, except for that I think the quality of that criticism wasn't always on the nose. Like the character of that criticism wasn't always on the nose. And I think fundamentally, what this ended up being an interesting portrait of, and I know this is going to be tedious and somewhat frustrating for folks, but I think it's interesting to consider that there's, I think, a fundamental value gap between Norm Finkelstein and myself, where I see value in Barack Obama's political ability in terms of his ability to persuade, to, you know, appeal to masses of people, to be all things to all people. I don't think that's necessarily a deficit. I think the problem is that he used those gifts for evil ends and to distract people from the idea that he was actually going to be a conduit for genuinely progressive politics. You know, that's the problem. The problem isn't that Obama is a flake or superficial. The problem isn't that he was lifted up by white liberals per se. The problem is that he pretended to be something that he wasn't. And he disillusioned a whole generation of people who basically put down their pitchforks after the recession at a real revolutionary moment and agreed to get behind him and his coalition, thinking that he was really going to be the hope and change candidate, which he wasn't. And I don't really care about law review or any of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Professor Finkelstein just holds a very particular kind of life of the mind in the highest possible esteem. And the notion that somebody might have an undue claim to it or be praised by people that he himself respects unfairly just like really, you know, rankles in a way. But I think that is a concern that is like, frankly, kind of niche to like being part of academia and like holding a very specific set of values that, frankly, I don't think most people do.
Yeah. And look, it's completely fine if someone does think that reading Latin and studying Greek and applying yourself for 9 hours a day and being wonky in that way is laudable. But I think it's only laudable to the degree that it's in service of something good, once again. So the fact that Chuck Schumer really applied himself, I don't have an intrinsic value. And I'm sorry, this is maybe going to get me in trouble. I don't have an intrinsic value for like academic rigor or pure smarts or anything like that. I don't care. Yeah. If you're brilliant and evil, I'm sure Henry Kissinger is like very smart. Like, who cares? Hillary Clinton's brilliant. Who cares? And Barack Obama, the idea that we're even really debating this in the first place, I think is just sort of beside the point. And the fact that there has already been so much, frankly, right-wing focus on Obama's qualifications and intellect, it just feels like you're walking into the lion's den unnecessarily when there is so much good meat to critique about the man.
Yeah. And we had mentioned that, like, this plays into a dynamic that has bothered you and me for a long time, which is the sort of supposed populist values of the left and how that can clash with its intellectual pretensions. Yeah.
It's like, and you mentioned that it's like the tension that we always have around people, I feel like on the left, not respecting comms. And there's a real willingness to say, I don't care about tweets. I don't care about comms. You're not a real organizer. I'm not, obviously. I'm not any kind of organizer. Unlike Barack Obama, I never claimed to be. But, there's an unwillingness to see the value of comms. There's an unwillingness to say that we need to think about messaging and how to persuade to actually advance our interests, and that comms and organizing should be working hand in hand to be mutually beneficial. And so it's, to me, a critique of Obama without a plan to get it to an audience that will hear it is not, what's the point? What's the point? I say this to Adolph Reed too. And Adolph Reed, to his credit, he was like, yeah, of course, I don't go into Black communities saying Obama sucks. Mm-hmm. He understands how to soft walk that. And I don't think Norm Finkelstein has any intention of going anywhere in any community and really delivering this message. This is for, I think, a different audience entirely. But I got to say, it's not just the fact that I think the way he put it was unpersuasive to folks who need to hear it. It's also that I think a part of me was rankled by the idea of Obama needing to subscribe to a kind of value system, a very narrowly circumscribed elitist version of intelligence to feel like that counts. And as someone who jumped through all the hoops, who has a very similar academic profile to Barack Obama, I mean, my thought is, I guess I don't study all those hours a day. I wasn't top of my class. I didn't even try out for law review, much less become head of the Harvard Law Review. So does that mean I'm lazy? And does that mean that I am not intellectually rigorous? Or I don't want to put words in his mouth or whatever, And what does it matter? What if I'm the dumbest dullard on the planet? What does that mean about my intrinsic value and wealth? Why is that even a part of worth? Why is that even a part of a conversation about me to begin with?
Yeah, I think there are some people who have such a sort of, I don't want to say monomaniacal, but maybe monomaniacal devotion to the pursuit of truth as they see it, that they see soft walking that as sort of like undermining that pursuit. And I think that's like a fundamental difference that you have where like you obviously care about what is true, but you also care about like convincing other people to adopt that as their truth as well.
There's no one truth. This idea, like, are we really going to have to get philosophical about this? This idea that there's some universal truth is also absurd.
Yeah, epistemology now with Brianna Joy Gray.
I mean, this is crazy. It's relevant in the Talia conversation as well. It's relevant whenever we're talking about any untoward population of people. And this is, I think, fundamental to understanding how persuasion works. I don't know how much I want to go back down this road. I'm contemplating whether or not I want to reopen that particular can of worms. But you are never going to persuade anybody of anything if you think that there is one universal truth and it's yours and you lay the sole claim to it. I'm sorry, you're just not. And in a political world, your goal is not to get complete allegiance of ideology. Your goal is to get someone close enough to you to choose the political option that's the better of the ones that are presented.
Yeah. And the way that you convince people is you don't like bludgeon them over the head with opposing sets of facts that they like probably already reject. It's that you tell a better story.
Right. And it's the same with the Liz Bruenig article that people were mad about with the getting anti-vaxxers to take the COVID vaccine. It's the same with all the things. It's Elizabeth Bruenig is not saying to folks, you're completely right. COVID is a Chinese hoax, but take the vaccine anyway. Like, that's not an argument. Obviously, she's not advocating that. She's not advocating for people not to be anti-vaxxers. But her point is that in her conversations with her family members in Texas about why they don't take the vaccine, it's more useful for her to listen to them, hear their concerns, find the part of their concern that resonates in truth, and then address it with an alternative. So if someone says, I'm concerned that people are having negative side effects from the vaccine, I'm concerned that I'm going to have to miss work because I'm going to feel ill. Telling someone, shut up, you're not going to feel ill is stupid. Obviously, people feel ill. Some people have a bad reaction and are out of work for a day. Some people have, like every single vaccine in the world, there are people who have legitimately bad reactions. But the point is that you appeal to the fact that the risk is higher from not taking it. You treat people like they're human beings and not monstrous villains who should be banished from the earth and from hospitals, like some people are arguing, because they haven't taken the vaccine. And you make them feel heard, not because it's like you're compromising your own values, but because, frankly, they're human beings who deserve to be heard. I'm sorry, all of this, every single thing about my political project comes from being a humanist. I'm a humanist first, not a socialist, not a communist. Like, my first ideological commitment is to humanism. And I'm never going to adopt, and this is going to make people unhappy, and that's fine, and we can be different. As a humanist, I would like to think that we can have different opinions and still treat each other with respect. But I'm never going to cotton on to a political project that requires you to be quite so personally mean and vindictive and evil to anybody. Not because the other person necessarily always deserves that respect, but because of what it means about who I am as a person to behave in that way towards somebody else. This is the rationale behind the death penalty for a lot of people not supporting the death penalty. Even if the person is completely evil and completely guilty, and as leftists, you would think that people understood this and that it's not catering to Nazis and wanting to kiss a Nazi to want to protect my own integrity as a human being and not wanting to be the thing that I despise.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, that seems like a healthy sort of philosophical approach to interacting with humans as a general thing. I think that's slightly different from, I mean, like, nobody has infinite political time and infinite political energy, so you have to make choices about who you wish to approach and extend that olive branch. And
yeah, and the priority is obviously not, coalition building with Nazis. And it was a little frustrating for that to be kind of the narrative out there, because obviously we're only talking about Nazis because that was Talia's project, right? She chose to embed with Nazis, and to me, there's a limited world of things to ask about that, because I don't know about you, but I'm familiar with the idea of Nazis and that they're bad, then they exist, and they're evil. Okay. So the follow-up questions, I mean, some people were like, why didn't you ask her something different? And I said, well, tell me what you think the big takeaways from the book are. But her explicit goals with that book were to find and dox Nazis.
Right.
And, that is not so interesting to me, I will admit. It's a thing that you do, but I don't have a lot of follow-up questions about that. Like, you found the Nazis and you doxed them.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, you were talking about two different things, right? Like, you were turning the conversation towards towards coalition building with like a much larger group of people than like the relatively narrow slice that she pretty much exclusively focuses on.
But also, I don't even care. Like, I asked broadly about coalition building, but another way to put it is, what did you learn? Did you get any insights about anything in the process? Did you learn anything from spending a year talking to very intimately this percentage of the population that is very foreign to me interpersonally for obvious reasons?
Yeah.
As much as I might, in the mind's eye of many folks on the internet, be very intimate, mouth to mouth, cheek to cheek with Nazis, I, in fact, don't have a lot of familiarity with them socially. And I do think that, I think there's something, there's a definitely prurient interest to like, well, what is it like? What did you learn about them? And to me, it's a little bit telling to have spent so much time in any community and to not be able to really articulate much in the way of insights about them. And as I'm not saying it has to be flattering insights, no one's trying to humanize anybody, but what did you learn? Did you learn anything about what radicalized them to begin with in a way that would prevent radicalizing? Did you learn anything about how to find them out? What motivates them? Did you learn anything about what takes your regular Nazi living without ever really like hurting anybody to being a shooter, like a mass shooter? What is the tipping point?
Yeah, I mean, this is one species of extending, I don't know, not necessarily empathy, but sort of, like a humanistic interest in these people as people. I think that she has zero interest in really exploring that.
But I think the questions that I ask aren't even about interest in them as people. It's truly self-preservation. Well, what is it that radicalizes them? I don't want to know because I want to like write an ethnography of Nazis. I want to know because I want them to not be radicalized and kill people.
Yeah.
I want to know what the tipping points are for them. You know, did you learn things about how easy it is for them to access guns? How many of them do have guns? Like, what are the kinds of things that plot them? Who are the kinds of people that they focus on? Like, there's any number of insights that you could learn from that experience that aren't about making anybody look better. Quite right. To the contrary. But there was just immediately such, and I understand the reasons why, like, I've come to understand the reasons why that she had the reaction that she did. I wish we could all have a little bit more confidence in each other and know that we're coming from a good place so that we can have a healthy conversation. And I think that was a little bit of an issue with Norm Finkelstein as well, even though he's very familiar with me and my work and reached out to me in part because he knows, you know, I am someone who doesn't shy away from what we could criticizing weaponized identity.
Yeah, I think an important context for this is that he specifically said be aggressive.
Right. Yes. So, yes. But I still feel like at a certain point, there was an implication that I was wanting to be protective of Obama because I was sensitive in the way that liberals are to protecting him as a black man with a certain kind of legacy, which I think, you know, gives me a little bit of a chuckle because, to be honest, I write things all the time and I show them to my mom and my mom was like, okay, Brianna, we'll consider tempering your language here and there about Obama. She's the one lecturing me to lay off Obama.
Yeah.
And I think I'm usually follow her advice because she's right. It's not worth it. My own little personal dig just isn't worth it at the end of the day. And one of my most popular early articles, I did some dig at like one of those other civil rights hero types, Jim Clyburn or, you know, John Lewis. Somebody had done something and I said something a little snarky about it. And she advised that I tone it down. And I think that she was right. Because if something like that had been in there, it would have derailed the rest of the message. And it's not about undermining my integrity or like not standing up for what I believe in or, you know, anything like that. It was a more powerful piece without my pettiness in it.
Right.
And I'm allowed to be petty. I'm petty with you all day and night, Ben. You know what happens when we turn this camera off and I go off on a tirade. You know, I'm not above it all. I truly am not. But I don't know. I think I have a lot of respect for Norm. I hope the book does get published and people get to see it because I think there was a lot of really interesting stuff in there. And I certainly don't want to have a reputation of being like this pedantic interviewer who won't let things go.
Well, I think we should convene a panel of a person who has spent the last 30 years studying Lacan, somebody who's been living under a bridge, and somebody who's been tabling like some kind of like community organizing thing outside of their local Walmart and hash this out.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think there was really something to be said for maybe I should be having different kinds of people on. And that is my fault for basically asking someone to like play by my rules and indulge my political interest who isn't there, who has a different project. Like Talia obviously has a different project. Norm has a different project. I also think, though, that I'm a known quantity at this point. We've been doing this show for a year now. I have never hidden the ball about what these interviews are like and what they do, what I do on them. Mm-hmm. And people can also, at this point, kind of self-select and not come on the show if they don't want to be asked why they believe what they believe and whether they have evidence for that. And I completely respect that there's no rule, there's no law of physics. I mean, I have to check with Obama, but there's no law of physics that says you must come on bad faith.
True.
So the lesson here is like, guests stay away. Let's shut this whole enterprise down. No, you know what I'm saying. You guys all know what I'm saying. So, Thank you for your patience. I do think that I am fascinated by these kind of like rhetorical tete-a-tetes. I found it to actually be, it was exhausting, but I think worthwhile work on some level. And I appreciate that Norm has the tenacity to stick with that kind of a conversation and to drill down in that way. And hit us up with suggestions for guests that you'd like to hear from, that maybe it's not such an uphill battle because we are more aligned on this journey toward the one true truth, which is that comms is good. Keep the faith, guys.